Yeah. So, I mean, you talk about corruption and hollowing out and kind of covering up that rot that you described, right? Um, what was the effect of 2008 in that? Because that was a huge crisis, and it seems very similar to what's happening right now in financial markets. What was the result of that? Why is it allowed to get to this point?
Yeah, it was very frustrating for me, as I described earlier. I tell this story sometimes. I remember when TARP didn't pass the first time, right? And then they made Congress vote again so they could pass it. I couldn't sleep. And I got into the office very early that morning, and there was like 5 people there, but the head of trading was there, and I stood up and I was just ranting. I was like, "This is it. You're never coming back. From this as the same country again. It'll never ever be the same." And my boss was like, "Mike, sit down, take a walk around the block." So I just sat down, but I'll never forget that moment because it was very clear to me that there was this opportunity. Okay, there was an opportunity to really say, okay, there are systemic problems here. We shouldn't just try. We should take this as a lesson, and we shouldn't just try to patch it all back together and pretend nothing's wrong. There's clearly things that are very wrong, and so the response was, and you see it in the data since, to help people that needed help the least, to all the people involved heading up these financial companies, whether they went bust like Lehman or not, they all came out of it extraordinarily wealthy, not in jail. That was the lesson. Okay, that was one of the big lessons. So any sort of criminal, right, any sort of criminal worth their weight is going to look at that and say, corporate criminal, white collar criminal is going to say, oh, it's open season now. Nothing's going to ever happen to us, so let's just go for it. And Epstein, is another example of it. Now Weinstein's finally in jail, but the point is, elite criminals, basically, I call them super predators because they're the most dangerous, basically took that as a signal that, okay, well, there's nothing that we can do that'll put us in jail. There's nothing that we can do. So the last 10 years just became this gigantic looting spree. And I was very frustrated at the time by the reaction from a lot of people. I know a lot of people were upset, but what I now realize is we were facing a generational crisis at the time that we just weren't prepared to sort of have a reaction to, because if you're a younger millennial, or if you're like a middle millennial, you were too young then to realize. So in other words, that millennial generation that was about to get shafted and turned into debt slaves for forever, essentially, it looks like, they were too young to understand and appreciate what was happening to them. Some of them were still in high school. Others were maybe starting into the workforce, but they didn't understand the extent to which that they were getting scammed. And now they do. So it's going to be interesting to see the response of that generation that has been so shafted going forward. But that was I think a big part of the problem. The people that were going to be hurt the most generationally were just too young to know what was going on.